This video concerns the UK Supreme Court and whether it can be said to be too powerful. Pictured there is an American, Alexander Hamilton, who most students these days will recognise from the Broadway musical. Hamilton once said that the judiciary is the least dangerous branch of government as it wields neither the sword nor the purse. Now in the United States, the executive, the president, wields the sword, Congress controls the purse and funds programmes, whereas the judiciary simply interprets the law. And historically, the Supreme Court has been the one of the three branches of government that's best respected, certainly in America. Now, why is all of this relevant? Well, since the opening of the UK Supreme Court, it has become more prominent in British politics. Some have argued that it's become overly powerful and politicised, and our judges are now simply politicians in robes. So this video is going to discuss whether or not we can say that the Supreme Court is too powerful. Now, historically, the Supreme Court has had a quasi-legislative function. Now, that may be pronounced in certain ways. In America, you're more likely to hear it's quasi than quasi or quasi. I'm not quite sure what I usually go with. I would probably, as a common northerner, go with quasi-legislative purpose. And the word quasi, however you want to pronounce it, essentially means almost. So if something has a quasi-legislative function, it's almost acting like a legislature. And the reason that we can say this about the judiciary for centuries in the United Kingdom is that the judiciary has historically established precedents under common law, and that seems to have the same constitutional importance as statute law. So one example of common law established over the centuries is laws against outraging public decency. Now, in the early 2000s, there was this growing movement, this growing outrage against a practice known as upskirting. Now, upskirting, as you can see there, is when a person takes a picture under a person's clothing without their permission. Now, prior to 2019, it was not an offence under statute law, but common law, because people who had been found guilty of those crimes were said to have outraged public decency, which is an example of common law. So that principle existed under common law for a very long time. And then there was a campaign led by women to make this statute law, and Parliament eventually passed the Voyeurism Offences Act in 2019. And so what we can see there is that we could say, okay, the UK Supreme Court has become more powerful in recent years, but that function of establishing precedents under common law, that's existed for a very long time. And we can use the upskirting example prior to 2019 as an example of the court doing this job. But also please keep in mind that the judiciary was doing this long before the Supreme Court had been created. Now, officially, the UK Supreme Court has no more power than those people pictured there. The people you can see pictured there are the law lords. And remember that in the world before the UK Supreme Court, the highest judges in the land sat in the House of Lords. Now, officially, the UK Supreme Court has no more formal power than the law lords did. But it does appear as though the UK Supreme Court has more authority, and that could be down to the way in which we perceive the Supreme Court. Now, a possible 9-mark question that you might get is to explain and analyse 3 reasons for the increased authority of the UK Supreme Court. And what I would go for, if that was a question that you were asked, is, in the first place, I'd talk about the appointments process. So, an independent appointments process, which seems more transparent, has given the UK Supreme Court more authority And we're gonna link into this with the second point, that separation from the legislature. I think prior to the UK Supreme Court, and because the law lords were in the legislature, people simply assumed that the highest judges in the land were simply part of a wider network of Parliament. Whereas having an independent appointments process for the best judges in the land, and a transparent process of bringing them to the bench, has given the Supreme Court more authority and more respect. Secondly, I've sort of hinted at it in the first one, separation of powers, and that the physical separation helps. The fact that these judges no longer physically sit in the Lords, but they sit at the Supreme Court across Parliament Square. So if you walk out of the UK Supreme Court, the first thing you will see across the road, across Parliament Square, is Parliament itself. So a greater separation of the judiciary from the legislature in particular means that the court is seen to have more independence and more authority. And then the third one, big word for me, both to spell and pronounce, demystification. And again, this is similar to the first point I made. I mean, the idea that the public has become more aware of the work of the judiciary since the Supreme Court was created. The public is more aware of its work through greater coverage in the media. Supreme Court has its own website where you can look into the individuals sitting on the Supreme Court, or the opinions on key court cases, but also public visits and the openness of the Supreme Court building means that there is this growing awareness of the work that the judiciary does, particularly the UK Supreme Court itself. So if there was a 9-mark question on to explain and analyse 3 reasons, it'd be to analyse and explain, wouldn't it? To analyse and explain 3 reasons for the increased authority of the Supreme Court, those would be the 3 factors that you go for. On the next slide, we're going to look at an extract question and how we would approach that. So, the question is, analyse, evaluate and compare the arguments in the extracts over the extent to which the UK Supreme Court has become too powerful in recent years. So just from looking at the 2 headlines, we can see that we've got one extract referring to the Supreme Court as the defender of liberty, liberty meaning freedom, and then secondly, judicial sabotage. So we've got 2 very different points of view on the judiciary straight away. Before we look into what the extracts actually say, let's look at the provenance. So the first one is from the Financial Times in 2019, and then the second is from the same year, 2019, from the Independent newspaper. And what we can see is we've got 2 respected newspaper media examples there commenting on the work of the Supreme Court. And I think that we could talk about the fact that the court's authority seems to be greater in British politics partially as a result of the coverage that the judiciary gets in the media, and that's how ordinary British citizens are able to see and figure out exactly what the court is doing. I always advise to think in 3s in politics. Obviously a 9-marker, 3 points, 3 paragraphs. And I would say that once you've done your introduction on an extract question where you're looking at the 2 points of view and where they come from and which is most convincing, aim for 3 paragraphs. Now we need to get balance in there, so you can't just cover extract A or just cover extract B. I always say highlight the 2 key quotes from each extract and then base 3 paragraphs based on those. And actually you can see there, both from 2019, and they both concern the very important, very memorable case where the Supreme Court declared that Boris Johnson's decision to prorogue Parliament was unlawful. And you see 2 opinions on the matter. So the 2 key quotes that I've gone for is First of all, the government cannot arbitrarily prorogue Parliament. When something is arbitrary, it is done without good reason. It's done just for the sake of it. So if a teacher was to arbitrarily hand out detentions, they're doing it not necessarily because they've got reason to do it, but simply because they can. So here, to say that arbitrarily proroguing Parliament, the government did not have good reason to do it. It did it because it was in its best interests, and it didn't have any legal authority to do so. The second key quote said that the decision was a reassertion of constitutional principles, that parliamentary sovereignty be taken seriously. And the point being made in the Financial Times is that nothing new has been decided here. The Supreme Court hasn't taken it upon itself to increase its own powers. It is simply reasserting a constitutional principle that is centuries old, which is Parliament is sovereign. And that powers taken away from Parliament, in theory, when Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973, that those powers that were taken away from Parliament were now essentially being gifted back to it through revoking Article 50. And essentially, the Supreme Court reasserted that Parliament was sovereign in this case, and that the executive didn't have the right to do it. So the point being made in the extract is that nothing new is being decided here. This is not a landmark case for the Supreme Court and its powers. It's simply reasserting a centuries-old principle. In extract B, it says that the court's ruling was a political step. So here in The Independent, the author is making the point, in their opinion, that this is a politicised judiciary. And you saw criticisms of the Supreme Court as a result of this. We saw it through the whole Brexit process. You'll remember the Enemies of the People newspaper headline on the Daily Mail's front page. And so criticisms that the Supreme Court has become political, and this case is one of those examples. So the author is arguing here that the Supreme Court wasn't reasserting parliamentary sovereignty, it was asserting its dominance over the Prime Minister. Contrary to extract A, extract B calls it a change in the balance of constitutional power. So the author sees this as the court trying to assert its power over the executive. And it finishes by saying, first the MPs tried to sabotage the referendum result, now the Supreme Court. So we can tell from this is that we've got a pro-Brexit author who sees this as an attempt to frustrate what they call the will of the people. They said earlier up, but it's not one of my two key quotes, this is the establishment fight back against the people's vote. So I think what the point of view of this author is that the establishment, Parliament, the Supreme Court, those with political power are trying to frustrate the people's movement that is Brexit. So I think the author views this as a politicised Supreme Court and sees the Supreme Court acting politically. Now, you can use that to help influence your conclusion on which is most convincing. If you agree that the Supreme Court has become political and you've got evidence to support it, you could use that as reason to say that it is more convincing and explain why you believe the Supreme Court to have been more political. However, if you think that the author's viewpoint as a pro-Brexit author influencing how they view the role of the Supreme Court, if you think that the Supreme Court is actually simply doing what it has always done, interpret the law and uphold the Constitution, then you might be more likely to say that extract A is the most convincing of the two. You're considering whether or not the Supreme Court has become too powerful. So what you really need to judge is which of these extracts do you agree with in this case? Do you agree that was this a political act by a Supreme Court wanting to frustrate Brexit? Or does the Supreme Court now not necessarily have more power, but more authority in the eyes of the British people as a result of its recent work since its creation in 2009? So that's where you go with that. Your introduction, don't forget to get some provenance in there and tell me about the articles and where they come from. When they were written is really important because they were both written in 2019, the year of that landmark case where the Supreme Court decided unanimously that Boris Johnson had extended the powers of the executive unlawfully by, in effect, lying to the Queen that the prorogation of Parliament was necessary. So the timing of the articles is important. You could talk about two well-respected newspapers. You could also talk about political point of view, because I think we've got a pro-Brexit author in the second extract, in extract B, and that affects the viewpoint of the Supreme Court. And then remember your 3 points based on quotes from the extracts. Now, if you wanted to directly compare them, so you might say, that in the first paragraph that they both concern the prorogation case and take a quote from each one. That's absolutely fine. But my advice is 3 paragraphs based on a quote from one of the 2 extracts, making sure that you have balanced discussion of both. Now, that's something of misleading advice, because on the one hand I'm asking you for balance, but on the other hand I'm asking for 3 paragraphs. So you will inevitably end up talking about one extract more so than the other, but please do make sure that you mention both. Then in your conclusion, tell me which of the 2 is most convincing and why.